Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the Little Ice Age. In Part 1, Medieval Meltdown, we will talk about how the medieval warm period led to a time of general prosperity for Europe. Tragically, those happy times were ended by a global cooling cycle, which led directly to the Great Famine of 1315, the spreading of the bubonic plague and its attendant evils, yet Europeans ultimately adapted to a cooler world. Though the medieval era is often characterized as a time of primitive barbarism, Europeans from 900 to 1300 AD enjoyed relative prosperity. The Earth's temperature warmed 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit compared to today, which might sound minor, but it led to longer growing periods, regular rainfall, and thus better harvests. The population of Europe rose from a low of 20 million in 900 AD to almost 70 million in 1300 AD. Many peasants raised enough grain to sell surplus on the open market, devoted time to handicrafts which they could sell for even more money, and ultimately save enough to buy their own plots of land. England became so warm that it developed a wine industry, and French lords petitioned the king for taxes on English wine to keep their vineyards from going under. A cultural and intellectual renaissance began, likely enabled by these fruitful harvests. Modern universities formed in major cities. Windmills spread across Europe. Arabic scholars translated Greco-Roman texts, which led to new studies in astronomy, medicine, and practical inventions like the padded horse collar. This down-to-earth invention allowed horses to pull plows and wagons without strangling themselves, which led to even better harvests and faster transportation. This new prosperity showed itself in the great cathedrals like the Gothic masterpiece in Milan and the famed Notre Dame de Paris. International trade revived, with the Italian city-states leading the way in creating new routes to Asia. However, as noted in the Bible, this too shall end is a proverb that applies to both good times and bad. Europe's good times ended with the beginning of the Little Ice Age. It was likely caused by solar changes. Fewer sunspots led to less solar radiation, and thus cooler temperatures and more unpredictable weather. The Little Ice Age first showed itself in alpine villages around 1300 AD, when Swiss herders noticed glaciers slowly but steadily encroaching upon their communities. Convinced the ice sheets must be possessed by the devil, the peasants sought help from priests. They attempted to exorcise the demons from the ice with holy water. Sadly, it did not work, and the ice sheets gradually devoured Swiss farms and pasture land. In the first decade of the 1300s, the weather became more unpredictable, with extreme heat in the summers and bitter cold in the winters. This, in turn, stunted crop yields. For the first time in living memory, Europeans faced food shortages after an extended period of population growth. They still had a much-grown population to feed, even as crops shrank. Diseases like cholera and dysentery related to poor nourishment began to appear with alarming regularity. Disaster came in torrential storms that slashed across the continent. During the spring of 1315, whole days passed with no one seeing the sun. Farm fields vanished under vast lakes of muddy rainwater. Dikes built to control water burst, leading to the flooding of entire communities. People had to abandon villages inhabited for centuries and turn to life on the road, taking refuge in ditches or under trees while they listened to the terrible drumbeat of driving rain. In the emerging university and trade towns, water filled the narrow, winding streets. When people dared to venture out, they often found bloated corpses left by the floodwaters. With even basic work impossible, the crops began to fail. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 transformed a prosperous continent into a nightmare of hunger. Of Europe's 75 million people, over 7 million suffered the slow, painful death of starvation. Stories of the time told of people getting into vicious brawls over dead animals to eat, digging up graves to feast upon still warm flesh, and parents abandoning children in the woods so they would have enough to eat. Towns saw large-scale riots with enraged crowds bellowing for bread or blood. Armies of beggars appeared in towns. From this time, we have the horrific fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel, inspired by real parents who left their children to die in the woods. However, this would be nothing compared to the Black Death. Those who survived the Great Famine reached adulthood severely weakened, more prone to disease, and thus more likely to die in the event of a plague. The Black Death, also called the bubonic plague, originated in the Gobi Desert, most likely. Desert nomads had learned to avoid rats dying of the bubonic plague, and with so few people, the vermin and men who died of the Black Death in the Gobi Desert died lonely deaths in forsaken places. However, with the Silk Road having revived to feed newly rich Europe's appetite for exotic goods from China and Persia, the merchants brought the Black Death to the Far East. In its savage sweep across Eurasia, the Black Death killed almost 200 million of humanity's 500 million people. Europe became the last to suffer. Those who died of the Black Death began seeing black swellings appear on their armpits and necks. From the beginning, it caused terrible pain, and victims often walked with arms extended or necks cocked this way or that. As the disease progressed, their flesh turned necrotic, literally rotting away as they slowly died. Many faced abandonment by their friends and relations, who dreaded catching the great mortality. Men went into terrible panics as the plague raced across Europe. So many people died that the authorities turned to filling ditches with the dead, throwing corpses into the ocean, or simply burning them. Panic gripped Europe as young and old, rich and poor, sick and healthy died in appalling numbers. People claimed that looking upon a plague victim or even thinking of the disease could sicken a person. Terrified survivors turned to bizarre cures, like sitting around sewers and breathing in the fetid fumes in the belief that it would cleanse the air they breathed. Still, others made use of medicinal pastes made of human and animal feces. However, far too many searched for scapegoats, often blaming Europe's Jews. Convinced that a cabal of rabbis had poisoned wells across Christendom as part of a plot to take over the world, Christian mobs burst into the homes of European Jews in search of evidence. Even an empty cup could be taken as proof of mass poisonings, and dozens of Jews would be burned at the stake. The Holy Roman Empire, home to 1/4 of all Europeans at the time, became the center of a bizarre and terrifying phenomenon called flagellation, where penitents, hoping to win God's mercy by beating themselves, traveled in vast parties across Germany and eastern France. They stopped in each town, whipping themselves bloody before the church. Despite being condemned by the reigning pope, they continued. Not only did they often lead the pogroms against the Jews, but they began attacking churches, ransacking altars, and murdering priests. Some even claimed the power to raise the dead. Needless to say, the church lost its patience with the bloody-minded penitents and began forbidding them from entering cities. They died out not long after the plague. Going into the 1400s, the people of Europe found themselves coping with a colder world with less predictable weather. During the High Middle Ages, from about 1000 to 1300, peasants grew vast amounts of cereals, but stronger winds and more unpredictable weather meant that grains high above the ground could be easily blown off, and upon touching the ground, these grains perished quickly. While grain cultivation continued on a smaller scale, peasants turned to crop diversification. Vegetables lower to the ground and often hardier became more popular. Turnips, peas, and onions appeared more often on peasant tables, while many farmers phased out cereals. Four-field crop rotation practiced before began to emphasize crop diversity, as that reduced nutrient depletion in the soil. Clover became popular, in part because it enriched the soil, and better still, it served as fodder for animals. By feeding large numbers of cattle and sheep, the peasant farmers had more manure, which they could use to provide more fertilizer and compensate for the less predictable weather. Indeed, the lords took a keen interest in growing sheep as they could sell the wool for cash. The sheep also tasted much better than peasants. Despite the challenges and hardships created by the Little Ice Age, the adaptations made by Europeans proved remarkably successful. After bottoming out in the years following the Black Death, the population of Europe steadily recovered. By the year 1500, the population had almost returned to its pre-plague levels of about 80 million people. Yet the Little Ice Age would take an even colder turn that would knock Europe on its heels. We'll find out about that in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this installment of the Legendarium. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.